Welcome to a Legendarium special about thieves and outlaws in late medieval England. In this episode, we will talk about how social changes in late medieval England swelled the ranks of vagrants, beggars, and of course, thieves. When the outlaws judged a man to be an outlaw in medieval England, they declared him to be living outside the protection of the law, which meant that any man could steal from him, assault him, or even murder him without penalty. A man became an outlaw by failing to face trial when accused of a crime. If the sheriff found out that an accused man failed to face trial, he made appeals at 2 other courts to give the fugitive a chance to hand himself in and face justice. But if the accused criminal refused trial 3 times, the court declared him caput lupinum, or a wolf's head, to label him no better than a beast who could be hunted. Only men above the age of 14 could be declared an outlaw. Depending upon the severity of the crime, he could expect to lose his possessions, money, and any land that he owned. People lived in small, self-regulating communities and would readily recognize any stranger among them and likely report them to the authorities. Within those communities, people held large areas of land together, meaning that everyone could use that land to graze their cattle. They could also find resources such as firewood and water for their farms and homes. That made it possible for people to survive and even prosper within the medieval order, and gave respectable people a good reason not to turn outlaw. Sadly, this changed during the late 15th century when lords and rich farmers called yeomen began to purchase the common lands and then fence off their new property. Within the fences or hedges, they grew sheep for market. This ensured a steady supply of wool to fuel British trade, but also kept the poorest farmers from making a living. Additionally, a new generation of money-minded feudal lords began insisting on payment in cash rather than barley, and they hiked up rents accordingly. This made workless, homeless poor people an inevitable fact of life in Tudor England. Every town and village had a resident population of the beggared poor. In 1582, William Lambarde wrote that England had become overspread not only with unpunished swarms of idle rogues and of counterfeit soldiers, but also with numbers of poor and weak but unpitied servitors. Some blamed the Irish for sending over its beggars, while others declared the poor to be waste people, so degenerate they would not work even to feed themselves. In fact, these elderly, crippled, sick, and abandoned people developed their own strategies to survive without land or livelihood. These included renting their living space, to prostitution, to taking in wash. Of course, some simply took to a life on the road and living at the expense of others. Some members of the gentry turned to crime, most famously Gamaliel Ratsey, yet most of them came from the most impoverished ranks of society. This stands in stark contrast to the medieval era, in which the most dangerous outlaws tended to come from the gentry, since only one son would inherit the land. If second, third, fourth, or fifth sons didn't want to join the church or the army, they could take a third option and form an outlaw band. Yet, during the Tudor era, a typical outlaw started by leaving an unhappy and often impoverished home, hoping to find a better life or at least work elsewhere. After days of sleeping under hedges and begging for breadcrumbs, they found themselves unwanted and often feared, except among other such people who lived on the road, often led by the strongest and cleverest among them. Such a person would be known as an upright man, for they carried a staff wherever he went. He also claimed the right to have any woman among them first. Together, they learned strategies to survive. Less cruel vagrants turned to begging and developed cunning means to win the sympathy of the better off. They made fake seafarers' licenses so they could pretend to be unemployed sailors. They claimed to be recently released from prison and looking for work, and some simply pretended to be mute. The best actors became counterfeit cranks who went about filthy and unclothed to make people think them epileptics. They put soap in their mouths to make themselves froth whenever they needed a little extra cash or to sell the epileptic act. Beggars known as Abrahams went around pretending to be insane, and they sang and danced for the amusement of onlookers who might shower them with shillings. Of course, just as many vagrants found more money in thievery. The easiest prey tended to be country folk freshly arrived in the city, whom they called conies or bunnies. So-called courtesy men approached such people, pretended to befriend them, got them drunk, and then took whatever they could. A new vocabulary emerged to describe the many types of thieves who plied their trade in Tudor England's fast-growing cities. A prigger of prancers took horses from inns, sometimes offering to walk the horses of newcomers while they enjoyed a tankard of ale. Anglers went about town looking for open windows, then returned at night with an iron hook to lift whatever they could, usually clothes. Clapperdudgeons went around unclothed but for a patched cloak, begged for pennies, and then would pick the pockets of those who offered them charity during a moment of distraction. Washmen lay down in the highway and pretended to be injured, thrashing around and screaming to sell the act. When a good Samaritan stopped to help them, they would of course be robbed. Jarkmen, vagrants who could read and write, helped their less educated comrades on the road by forging licenses to beg, fake passports, fake certificates of military service, and even acted as proctors in court. The authorities heaped ever harsher punishments upon them, including burning a hole in their right earlobe with a red-hot iron under a 1572 law, and under a 1590 law, vagrants could be whipped at the stake. Yet being footloose, these criminals became adept at disappearing before the first sign of trouble. They also benefited from an increasingly popular form of social protest known as the riot. In August 1577, in Brentwood, 30 women whipped up by female vagrants, or doxies, seized Richard Brooke, a schoolmaster of Brentwood Grammar School, as word spread that he misused a female pupil. After they beat Brooke thoroughly, they holed up in the church, armed with pitchforks, bills, 2 hot pokers, kettles of boiling water, and bows and arrows. When local justices of the peace tried to round up a party to storm the church, none of the local men joined them, and the justices could only watch as most of the women escaped and the doxy ringleaders returned to the road in search of a new place to live. That wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.